Thank you so very much for being here. I'm very, very excited with the speaker and the talk that we have today. It's my dear, dear friend, Annick De Houwer, and co-author, but first friend and then co-author.
Right. Yes.
She's a professor and chair of language acquisition and multilingualism in the Department of Linguistics at Erfurt University, which is in Germany, very close to Weimar, the home of Goethe. She's a pioneer in the field of bilingual first language acquisition, BFLA, as she has termed the field. And her career really took off when she published, in 1990, she published a book with Cambridge University Press called The Acquisition of Two Languages from Birth, a Case Study. And this was a case study of the naturalistic morphosyntactic development of a 3-year-old who had been exposed to Dutch and English from birth, and when Annick studied her, she was 3. And so it was a matter of mapping the morphosyntactic development in both languages. And very few people, if any, had done that before, and especially the findings were very clear and very strong in favor of the until then hypothesis that children develop both languages simultaneously at a similar rate with similar benchmarks and milestones, and that there is nothing special and nothing wrong with bilingual development. She has also done amazing other studies, but one that is very impressive is a macro-sociological survey of home language use by 74,000 individuals. I don't know how you can get to that end size and not completely lose it all.
Yep, lots of students.
Yes. And she has 2 textbooks that she published in 2009 with Multilingual Matters. One is very thick and one is very thin. And so it's 2 versions distilling all the findings about child bilingual acquisition. First, bilingual language acquisition. She has spoken, presented, consulted all over the world, and it is really wonderful that she really speaks to linguists, psycholinguists, developmental psychologists, child language specialists, to parents, to teachers, to pediatricians, to speech pathologists, to government officials, and to community organizations. She really can speak to all these audiences and has done so for many, many years. She is also a very prolific writer and a true multilingual, leading a multilingual life. So she not only publishes in English, but also in French and in Dutch.
German too.
And German, of course, of course, of course.
Yes. But it's hard.
It is very hard, we know that. And she also has been associated with the Multiling Center in Norway that we have a grant with. Since its inception in 2012, she's been an advisory board member of Multiling. And she also is a consultant on one of the projects called Multi-Fam, for family, on family language policy. What else should I say about her? She is also the director of a foundation in Belgium that is devoted to the well-being of multilinguals through research and outreach. And she has partnered up with the Initiative for Multilingual Studies, and we are very, very happy and very proud of being partners in crime again. We've done many things together by now, but this one is a very special thing. And one more thing that I should say about her. She's going to be back at GERT for an invited colloquium on family language planning. Policy. And so if you can catch her then, don't miss that panel because it will be a very interesting, featuring researchers working with families and their language policies. With that, I will give you Annick, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks very much, Lourdes, for inviting me and for the wonderful introduction. It's really a joy to be here. I think I was here before and I gave a class when you had just started, I think, in 2011. Is that possible? It was right
12.
here.
12.
2012. Okay, so it's very nice to be back. Yes. So I'm going to be talking to you about harmonious bilingualism in bilingual families. Where does it start? Well, usually with this: love. Love. Right. Love creates families, a lot of them, all over. Diverse families. Different people from all over the world. In fact, you know, in the European Union, European Union, last year I think it was, they proudly announced that they think that the Erasmus program, so that's the student exchange program amongst European countries, that there are at least 1 million Erasmus babies. So there you go. You know, it's just a very diverse world. We know about that. So there is an increasing number of young families that find themselves in bilingual and multilingual settings. I mean, increased, we have that impression. Of course, we really don't know because we don't really have historical data that would really tell us, but there are few people who say that that's not true. So let's go with it. It's true. Yes. But there's also a lot of them who don't have much personal experience with multilingualism. They are a person who's been raised monolingually and then learned foreign languages at school, who meets up an equally monolingually raised person who learned foreign languages at school, and they often talk English to each other, which is neither of their first language, and then they get married and they have kids. And then the issue is like, what to speak to the children, right? And people just don't know. They don't have that experience within their own life. And they wonder how they should raise children bilingually, whether they should do so, or multilingually. And I'm here, actually, when I say bilingual, I really mean that to include multilingual. That's not really limited for me to 2 languages. And also it's not limited to me to 2 named languages. It could be different dialects, strongly different varieties as well. But, we can maybe talk about that in the question time if you want to. Many people worry about whether early bilingualism will be a positive or a negative experience for their children. So, indeed, it is true, and I've color-coded. When I say something in red letters, it means it's not so good. When it's green letters, it means, hey, it's better. That's my evaluation. Yeah. So, but early bilingualism can actually be a negative or a less than positive experience for children and their families. And when I first started out, Lourdes mentioned my book from 1990, where I had done research on children. Basically that's one case study, but I had collected data on many more children, and in fact, Dutch-English bilingual children. In fact, for 2 or 3 of those children that I recorded, basically I stopped recording because they spoke only one language. But I didn't go into people's feelings about it then. I was just a young PhD student. You don't learn everything at once. Okay. Right. But anyway, very soon, after I finished my PhD, or in the course of it, I did realize this, but I wasn't paying much attention to it then. So I think that this is what people want, namely harmonious bilingualism. And I introduced the term harmonious bilingual development, which is more specific in various publications, which maybe you've heard about. So also just now recently, I've really focused on harmonious bilingualism, so well-being for families in bilingual settings, in this book that's just come out, I think, Handbook of Social and Affective Factors in Home Language Maintenance and Development. And there's a lot more interest coming up in those social and affective factors, a lot more. So when I started out as a PhD student, nobody was talking about that. No. Doesn't mean that not occasionally did you find here and there a comment about it, but nobody was really focusing on it. Okay, and here, as I said, I have written in German. This is my first one. Well, just that's basically about what happens when children who are raised bilingually when they come into preschool. Okay. So, harmonious bilingualism, exactly. What is that? It refers to a sense of subjective well-being and satisfaction that young families, so that includes the parents and the children, really, that they experience in a language contact situation. So a language contact situation, that's any situation where it's obvious that there's language variation, and it's obvious and it's felt and realized by the people who are in the situation. And this would be in the absence of negative experiences, which are attributed to this linguistically diverse situation. So it can be a sense of subjective well-being, or just, also it's just normal, so I'm fine with it, or I'm not even thinking about it. I'm not attributing problems in my life to the fact that I am being raised bilingually, or that my family is a bilingual family, and so forth. So, of course, having this sense of subjective well-being in a bilingual setting is a very intensely personal experience. How can I say, how your feeling of well-being is, or your feeling of well-being? It's you. You decide, basically. It's not for me, the researcher, to decide how you're going to feel. Yet, I think we can make already at this point in time, based on various studies that have been carried out, and just also on experience with families, there do appear to be two main hallmarks of harmonious bilingualism. Namely, harmonious bilingualism is only really possible if there is a general acceptance of the fact that children are growing up with two languages. So, if your pediatrician says, no, speaking two languages is bad for your child, you got to speak just one, you're not going to have harmonious bilingualism, because what are you going to do as a parent? You're going to go against the advice of the pediatrician, and you're a first parent and you don't know, you want to do what's best, and they know best about kids, right? So this is very basic. There are often these negative attitudes towards early child bilingualism, or a particular home language. In my own case, when I took my child to school, we used to live in the United States, and then we moved to Belgium, and then I put her into a school, a Dutch-speaking school in Flanders, and I then said, oh, well, my child is bilingual. And they said, oh, no, that's not good. No, that's going to really confuse her. And I said, well, she speaks English very well, and Dutch too. Oh, English, oh, that's fine. It's the French they were thinking of. No good. Because they don't like French in Flanders. It's as simple as that. Parents themselves may hold negative attitudes. Relatives may hold negative attitudes. The influence of grandma, mostly, is very strong. Grandma disapproves. It's very difficult to go against that. As I mentioned, pediatricians may hold negative attitudes or may just not know. We should all realize that pediatricians are not trained in early child bilingualism. So let's not take them too seriously about that. Child care workers may hold negative attitudes. Unfortunately, they also are not really trained. Teachers, the same thing, although some things are moving in those two areas with child care workers and teachers. Family friends may hold negative attitudes, and there may be a generally negative attitude towards early bilingualism in the society at large. So this is really very difficult to combat. As a young parent who's just given birth, you've just got your new baby. Also for the fathers, it's the same problem, although Who can stand up to all of that? So that was one aspect of it. Then the next aspect is that children who regularly hear two languages, that they also actually speak them. That is really important for harmonious bilingualism to be in place. For, let me put it this way, for people to feel no particularly bad feelings about the languages that they're having in their situation. And Lourdes referred to my study in Flanders with the help of many students, yes, but we managed. That we found out that a quarter of children who hear a home language that is not the school language, they don't speak that particular home language. And so in this particular study, I'm here focusing just on the 2,250 families of the over 18,000 families that we surveyed, where in those 2,250 families, there was at least one parent who at home spoke a language other than the school language. In addition, that parent might have spoken the school language as well. And there were 5,320 children in those families, and of those 5,320, a full quarter did not speak two languages, but only one. And since then, just finished writing an overview chapter that also surveys other surveys that suggest the same proportion, more or less. It's between maybe 20% and 25%. In other places in the world, we get those same numbers. Even in the north of Australia, where children are learning or hearing Aboriginal languages and English, there's even a study showing, that a quarter of those children do not speak an Aboriginal language. So the same percentage. Plus there's a study from Miami, you find the same percentage. So this is it happens a lot, and it's not specific to Europe. Now, there are several possible reasons for why children do not speak a language that they hear at home. Well, maybe they don't hear that language frequently enough. That happens, that happens quite a bit. So if there's one parent who speaks that language to the child and nobody else, and that one parent doesn't spend a lot of time with the child, there's just not enough not enough language going around, because we do know that monolingual children, that they really learn from the environment, and that it matters. And the number of words that children learn depends on the number of words that they hear. Quite a simple relationship. Many linguists don't want to really accept this because it's too simple. But it's very important for these little children. We're talking about very little children. We don't know to what extent this effect continues over time, but for the very, very young ones, it's very important. So how often? Then the quality of what's called child-directed speech, so how people speak to children. The quality, what do I mean by that? Well, if I speak to a 1-year-old, if I speak to them the way that I'm speaking to you now, that 1-year-old is just not going to have any intake of this language use. Or if to a young baby, that's how it already starts, when a child is 2 months of age. I really do need to speak to a baby very differently than from how I speak to you. Yes, oh, you can smile. Oh, isn't that fun? Yeah, fun. And with the mimicry and everything, I need to help the child get an entrance into the language. And that's what I do when I'm using this infant-directed speech, this very particular way of talking to a young child. That's how I can help the child. And not all parents do this. Not even all mothers do this. And there are all cultural differences, but not only just cultural, also just individual differences in the extent to which people do this. Or also, and Pat Cool in Washington State has shown this to be the case, that infants at age 6 months, well, there's a huge difference, individual difference amongst them, just monolinguals. in how well they are able to perceive distinctions between particular vowel sounds and consonantal sounds. And she has traced this back to how clearly the mothers were enunciating. So if you mumble, your kid is going to have a problem figuring out what it is you're saying. Very basic. But that's what I mean by the quality of child-directed speech. I'm not even here referring, although that is also important probably, speaking with an accent and all that. Well, perhaps it has an effect, but we really don't know much about that yet. But it's mostly about, am I using speech that is really generally known to be supportive of young children's language development? Then, this is a very important one, the communicative need for active use of each language. I'm working on a chapter right about that because very little attention has been paid to that. It's like, how do I do in discourse? Liz Lanza, her work already, also her book from 1997, but her first article about it from 92, mentioned the importance of discourse strategies, of using in a conversation with a young, bilingually raised child, whether you allow them to use two languages with you in a conversation or not. So you socialize them into using a particular language or not. Like we socialize children into using polite language, into saying like, please, if they say cookie. I think many, many people would say, cookie, please. No. And then if they say, please, cookie, or peas, cookie, then they get their cookie, but they have to say peas, right? So it's like that you can do this, socialize children, but maybe not in that same way, in that same explicit way, but you can say, like, if your child is speaking to you in a language that at that moment you're not using with them, you can say, what? And maybe, well, Liz calls it feigning to be a monolingual, but I think in many cases, judging also from my own experience, it's not feigning. It's just you're in a particular language mode. I don't know if you've heard of Grosjean and his language modes. You're in a particular language mode as an adult. You can be in a bilingual language mode and be open to just anything that's being said and understand it. Or you can be in a more monolingual mode. I have a little bit of evidence about that from my own just private recordings of conversations with my daughter. I never did study her, but just where I'm hearing on the tape, I used to only speak Dutch with her when she was 2 years of age, and she was able to speak both Dutch and English. And I heard on the tape that she said something to me in English. Now, I understand English, but at that time, I really didn't. I said, what? I had not understood her because I wasn't expecting her to speak English to me. So, and I said, what? And she changed to saying it in Dutch, sorry. So I used a monolingual discourse strategy, as Ms. Lanzas has called it, rather than a bilingual one where I'm not paying attention to what language she's using. And so we need more information on the effect of this on children, but that's what I mean by a communicative need for active use of each language. If a child doesn't need to speak a particular language, they won't. It's very simple. Yeah. But a lot of parents are not aware of that. And a lot of researchers are sadly not aware of that either. And it takes a lot of effort to carry out studies like that, but there's one fantastic study more in an experimental vein by Park et al. 2012, where they actually had parents, I think there were like over 50 families that they engaged with Chinese English, where they had parents actually talk to children and they recorded it, and they actually categorized how parents were doing this, and then there was a time too later on. And lo and behold, the parents who were kind of allowing English or Chinese, well, 6 months later, their children were speaking even less Chinese because it was here in the United States than before. And those who had not allowed that earlier, well, those kids were speaking much better Chinese. So that's like the only study so far that really has shown some real proof there that it's really important. But the bulk of the studies now, as we have them, the case studies, shows that this is really important, the communicative need. And then there's actually the opportunities for children to actually speak each language. And it's here, practice makes perfect, and that actually is also a phrase used by Eve Clark, who's a specialist on monolingual child language acquisition, English. And she says that also, that just in one language, it's very important for a child to practice a particular language. And so children would need to be able to do that with people in both languages. And that's often, well, maybe not the case that there's, maybe there's a lot more opportunities for the one language in comparison to the other, for instance. And then there's also community expectations and attitudes, including children's own attitudes. If you can see it, yeah, it's at the bottom, sorry. So, and I'll talk about that a little later. There's also identity issues, and there's a whole lot more that we probably don't know about yet. So there are many possible reasons. But what happens if children only speak a single language in spite of parental input in the other one? What happens then? Well, it may become impossible for these children to communicate with members of their extended family and their family friends. And that can be, even with grandma who lives in Russia. And, Skype with grandma in Russia no longer possible because the child who lives here in the United States no longer speaks any Russian. Maybe they did when they were very young, but starting when they're age 4, when they start to go to preschool, the Russians just evaporated. So there's no relationship possible between the child and the relative, the important relatives also. And that's very sad, especially for the relatives, but also for the children. And then also, we know that communication between parents and children may be adversely affected. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Because both parents and children, and we know that from mostly research in the United States with adolescents and children, adolescents and their parents, that both parties may feel a sense of loss of identity, loss of culture, loss of emotional bonding. There are many studies actually that show this, and that it has to do with parents and children using the same language, speaking the same language to each other, but the same non-school language to each other in proficient ways, proficiently, at equal levels of proficiency also. So that is very, very important. I want to just add to this that lots of parents also feel adolescence is tough anyway. For the parents here, we know that all of us have been adolescents, and I think back and I think, oh, I'm pretty ashamed how I treated my parents as an adolescent. It's difficult for both parties. So if in addition to that you don't speak the same language to each other, it really creates this chasm. There is much less bonding going on, and parents claim that they have very little authority over their children if they cannot speak the same language, or they do not speak the same language as their children. Conversation is still possible, so the child will speak the school language and the parent will respond in the other language because it's their language and because maybe they're not so proficient in the school language, right? So it's not a good idea. And that is because language as a means of communication is highly, highly symbolic, and it relates to cultural and personal identity.